Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our talk this afternoon. I'm very excited for just the talk and the discussion that is sure to follow here. My name is Sylvia Abney, Department Head in Community Health and Epidemiology, and I just have a few words to say, and then Dr. Nazim Muhajirin from SPHERU will have a few words, then we'll introduce our speakers and kick things off. So I just wanted to start recognizing that we learn, teach, work, and live on traditional Indigenous territories that in Canada include treaty lands, unceded lands, and Métis homelands, and that we pay our respects to the First Nation, Métis, and Inuit ancestors. We are welcoming you today from Saskatchewan, ancestral home to the Nahiwak, the Nakawinawik, Nakota, Dakota, Lakota, and Denisoulini. This is Treaty 2, 4, 5, 6, 8, and 10 territory and homelands of the Northern and Central Southern Métis. Trying to use a bit of language as I am being taught, recognizing that Monday is Indigenous Languages Day around the world. The University of Saskatchewan is in Mississauga-Watomina, Métis homelands, and Treaty 6 territory. In our department's commitments to this place, we value respectful relationships with the people around us, past, present, and future, and the animals, lands, waters, and skies that nurture us all. We strive to live the following values in our programs, activities, and interactions. Relationships grounded in safety and humility, respect for all peoples and their worldviews, reciprocity in all relationships, relevance to holistic wellness, and responsibility for informed pedagogy and practice. We invite you to reflect on the Indigenous homelands from which you are joining us, those of us who are not in person, in your professional and personal commitments to taking up action for truth and reconciliation. Just wanted to say a little bit about today's event. What we're doing with today, this is the second of, could be 3 events, but certainly the second. With today's event, we're marking 2 important milestones. The 65 years for the Department of Community Health and Epidemiology and 25 years for SPHERU, both units with intersecting interests in public and population health equity in this province and globally. I will begin with a few remarks about the department and turn it over to SPHERU co-director Dr. Nazim Muhajirin to offer the same on behalf of the unit. So for those of you who don't know, I talked a little bit about this in December, but here's a refresher and new information for those of you who couldn't join us then. Our department was established in the College of Medicine in 1959 as the Department of Social and Preventive Medicine. Our focus was for some time on contributing these important lenses to the training of future physicians. Throughout the intervening 65 years, our department has been populated by remarkable faculty and leaders with a strong vision of health equity. The term community in our current name reflects an emphasis in our work on the creation, protection, and promotion of health within this context that includes intersections of geography, shared identity, and social ties, recognizing that these are the spaces in which people live their lives and navigate their well-being and that of their families. Today, the Department of Community Health and Epidemiology, that now also includes a division of public health and preventive medicine, is thriving. It's a dynamic academic and clinical department comprising 18 faculty, 25 medical faculty, and 28 associates and adjuncts. We have active graduate programs at the master's and doctoral levels and make a vital contribution to the undergraduate education of medical and health sciences students, as well as postgraduate education with our public health and preventive medicine residency program. Our teaching, research, and community engagements consider health across the spectrum from acute to preventive medicine and individual to population, with a lens on social justice and equity for all. Nazim, I'll invite you to come up.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to keep my remarks fairly short because I think this is the main event. But I want to first thank you, both Patrick Fafard and Evelyne de Leeuw, for being here with us. And you know, you see the title, Political Science in with for on Public Health, and I was thinking that the context in which this talk is happening. I don't know about you, but I can't take my eyes off of what's happening, the train wreck that is happening south of the border. It's, it's hard to take my eyes off, but it's also hard to watch. It is a cognitive overload that I could do without, probably, you know, as you are. My name is Nazim Muhajirin, as Sylvia introduced. I'm the co-director of Saskatchewan Population Health Evaluation Research Unit. What I want to do is just to get SPHERU researchers, either put your hands up or stand up here in the room, and those of you who are online, maybe you could turn your camera on. I'd just like to have you be recognized. So, you know, hand up there. You know, for SPHERU in Research Center. Thank you very much. So you see the presence here. SPHERU started in 1999 fall with the recruitment of Dr. Labonte, Ron Labonte, who both of you know. And I started working with Ron right away, but then I came on officially on board on SPHERU in January 2000. So the past 25 years, I would say we have had a good run. You know, it's easy to measure the traditional metrics of publications, research dollars, people who we have mentored, and so on. But the one that I think that I am most proud of, we are most proud of SPHERU, is the contributions that we have made to public and social discourse on health, and also change in whatever we can in society. Just last week or within the last 10 days, to give one example, Saskatchewan government signed on to the National School Meal Program. You know, one of the laggards to sign on to the program, but we did sign on to this program, and the person behind that, you know, one of the people behind that, the leadership, the research, and the advocacy, you know, that was that led to this was our own Rachel Engelstringer. Just to give one example, most recent example of SPHERU's, you know, contribution to social impact and in this province and beyond. So I'll stop there in terms of SPHERU's contribution, but I'm very glad that that our guests are here. Going back to the cognitive overload, I think the kind of cognitive simulation that we want is going to be provided by both Patrick Fafard and Evelyne de Leeuw. And so I think you are in for a treat, for real, you know, deep discussion on how research get into the policy, you know, sphere. So with that, back to Sylvia.
It is my pleasure now to introduce Dr. Evelyne de Leeuw. She's a professor and holds the Canada Excellence Research Chair in One Urban Health at Université de Montréal. The chair connects two exciting health promotion fields, healthy cities and One Health. She is also a Professorial Research Fellow at the University of New South Wales in Sydney, the Cities Institute. Here she assists in health promotion dimensions of urbanism and healthy public policy. Evelyne has a decades-long connection to the global health promotion community, so this was very cool, actually, for health promotion geeks. She was at the 1986 First International Health Promotion Conference in Ottawa that resulted in the Watershed Ottawa Charter for Health Promotion. This stirred her critical appraisal of the idea of healthy public policy, later health in all policies, with a focus at the local urban level. With Dr. Patrick Fafard, she edits a book series on health political science. An upcoming book with Cambridge University Press called Well Together looks at intersectoriality and One Urban Health. Current research projects include a strategic health governance vision of vertical cities, including Montreal's underground city, urban cartographies of biodiversity, ruminant grazing in urban parks, reintroducing nature into healthcare systems, walkability for health and healthcare, transport justice in and for First Nation communities, policies for the gut microbiome and urban microbiome, place, culture, and health in Aboriginal communities, well-being and place-based spirituality and eco-anxiety. Dr. Patrick Fafard has enjoyed a lengthy career that spans both government and academia. In Saskatchewan, he served as the executive director of the policy branch in Saskatchewan Health and for the Saskatchewan Commission on Medicare led by Ken Fyke. He later served with the Government of Canada as a Director General in the Privy Council Office. Patrick has a PhD in political studies from Queen's University. His academic interests are wide-ranging, and he is the author, co-author, or editor of numerous publications on public health governance, the role of science in policymaking, and Canadian intergovernmental relations. His work has appeared in numerous journals, the Journal of Public Health, Health Policy, Evidence and Policy, Policy and Politics, Public Health, and the Canadian Journal of Public Health. He is co-editor with Evelyne de Leeuw and Adele Casola of Integrating Science and Politics for Public Health, and serves as co-director with Evelyne of the monograph series, Palgrave Studies in Public Health Policy Research. Patrick's current teaching and research includes science diplomacy, public administration of public health, and global health governance to address the challenge of antimicrobial resistance. He also holds the research chair in science diplomacy at the University of Ottawa. Patrick also serves in the leadership roles with the Global Strategy Lab, York and UOttawa, and is a member of the Center for Health, Law, Policy, and Ethics and the Institute for Science, Society, and Policy. So there's a whole lot of scope here for discussion today. I'm absolutely thrilled to welcome you both here for the conversation that we'll have over the next hour or so. The other person that we will have here, he was hoping to be here in person today, is Dr. Tom McIntosh, who's the Associate Dean Research and Graduate at the University of Regina Faculty of Arts and Professor in the Department of Politics and International Studies. And you may learn that he and Patrick go back a long way. He is also a researcher with SPHERU that you heard a little bit about earlier. So we're going to hear a presentation, and then Tom is going to be a discussant and give a bit of a response and his thoughts. Thanks, Tom. He's up here somewhere. And then we'll have a Q&A as well, so opportunity for people online and in the room to ask questions and participate in the discussion today. And then towards the end, I'm going to invite Dr. Corey Neudorf to come up, and he's going to tie in some of what you're hearing today with upcoming work in the signature area on campus in health and wellness. So thank you very much. I'm going to turn the floor over.
Thank you very much for that very kind introduction. Our presentation is in 4 parts. We'll tell a sort of origin story of the growth of political science and health and public health. And in particular, we'll tell the origin story of the book that we co-edited. Then we'll spend a few minutes talking about the vast range of our current research. And then we thought it would be useful to take some time to pick up where Nazim was speaking about the future of political science for health and some of the challenges that public health faces both in Canada, United States, and more broadly. And then finally, and it'll sort of move over into the Q&A, what to do in a world in which dissent and distrust is increasingly common and the public health enterprise is probably challenged in ways that it has never really known. So why don't you start with the origin story?
Yes. Yes on. Um, yeah. So Sylvia just said that I was in Ottawa in 1986, which kind of was a mistake. I was the young apprentice of the wizard, the witch, Ilona Kickbush, um, and it was an immense experience to be in Ottawa in this conference that wasn't really a conference, it was a big workshop with a lot of very interesting people. And we really worked toward developing this Ottawa Charter for Health Promotion. And I assume all of you know the Ottawa Charter, and therefore you know that the outer ring in that charter says that we have to build healthy public policy. And I thought, after having studied in an experimental program in health science in the Netherlands, this is it, healthy public policy. That is fantastic. Because I had, in my studies, read the work by a man called Ivan Illich. And Ivan Illich, a classic. If you haven't read it, read it now. Medical Nemesis. He actually wrote about the idea of iatrogenesis, how doctors create disease rather than cure it. And my interpretation of that mechanism was that this is about politics. This isn't, you can't blame those individual doctors. You can't blame things that are happening in society. This is a political thing. Our systems, our political systems, do something wrong in creating and sustaining that. So I was very happy in Ottawa when that outer ring, build healthy public policy, was added. And I thought, now I will have to research this. Is it possible? Because this was rhetoric. Charters are rhetoric. So is it possible to build healthy public policy? And I did the research for 4 years. I collected data and I was thinking about all of this. Found, in fact, I discovered political science as a health scientist. I thought, wow, there's a whole new literature that's opening up. And in fact, right now being in Montreal, there's an entire new Francophone literature opening up, which I had not discovered. So there's another story to tell there. But so I applied political science to the question of healthy public policy. And after 4 years, the conclusion of my thesis was it is impossible to build healthy public policy. This was regrettable. One of my PhD supervisors was Nancy Milio, and Nancy Milio was the mother of the idea of healthy public policy. So we struggled quite a bit because she said, the fact that it's a good idea doesn't mean that you have to research it to death. Yeah. Now, the other mother of health promotion, healthy public policy is Ilona Kickbush. And Ilona Kickbush, in 1986, at the meeting in Ottawa, already realized that healthy public policy wouldn't fly at the national level. She was a very clever woman. That's why she started the Healthy Cities program of WHO, together with a Canadian who had proposed the idea in 1984 in celebration of 10 years of the Lalonde report. And that's how I'm so connected to Canada. So Toronto was the first healthy city in the world. And Ilona Kickbush adopted that idea and thought maybe there's a few European cities crazy enough to do this stuff. And there were hundreds. And I thought, well, if healthy public policy doesn't work nationally, surely this Ilona woman has a hunch it might happen at the local level. So I got associated with Healthy Cities in Europe from the very start. Did the research, but became a clearinghouse for healthy cities, eventually the director of a collaborating center for healthy cities. After that, I was the research director of European Healthy Cities. And meanwhile, I had a real career that made me money doing other things. I was Secretary General of the Association of Schools of Public Health in the European region, ASPHER. And all of this was good value because I could apply my political science insights to all of those jobs. Eventually, I ended up a few detours through Kazakhstan, El Salvador, Denmark, And in Montreal, I always have to apologize that French is my sixth language, so please bear with me if I don't speak it well. So English is only my third language. I had, when I landed in Australia, an urgent application from a Canadian health political scientist, and I hope that some of you know him, Eric Breton, who is currently working at the National School of Public Health, EHESP, in France. And Eric said, I want to do health political science with you. And I said, okay, what we are going to do is, since Ottawa, we've had 20 years of people doing research on healthy public policy. So we're going to do a systematic review and see how much of that research has been driven by political science insights. Sensible question. If you want to research healthy public policy, then you must deploy political science, no? So we found 6,000 papers that all claimed to do research on policy in health promotion. Of those, 500 said, we do this systematically. This is not just rhetoric, we do it systematically. We have a theory. Of those, 120 actually indicated the theory that they used, but most of them used Kingdon. If you are even remotely interested in political science in health, then you will have heard of the work of John Kingdon. And then what people do when they use Kingdon, they say, politics has three streams: policies, problems, and politics. And a policy entrepreneur has to open a window of opportunity. And then they move on with an entirely different story. So that's not how you do political science. So out of the 120 studies that did theory, we only found 9 that actually deployed a political science theory to health promotion issues. And they were bad studies too. So from that moment, I was on a mission. I thought, this is crazy. These health promotion people, if they really want to get this idea of healthy public policy that then was in the process of being replaced by health in all policies, you have to understand the politics. And for those of you who do not know, the short definition of politics is who gets what. It's about power and people who decide on your fate. And that's health promotion. If we are really interested in health equity, you gotta play the politics. And I was arguing for this. I was writing papers, and then Patrick Fafard crossed my path. Go.
So could you go to the next slide and this slide after? Because I don't think this thing works yet. Next slide. Okay. So I spent a career as a pracademic, going from government to universities, back to government. And in 2006, I joined the just created Graduate School of Public and National Affairs. And because it's a policy school, I think the ad that hired me said, you need to be, quote, present in the public debate. So as in universities, we claim to measure the things we do. So we claim to measure teaching, we claim to measure service. The only thing we really measure systematically, and even then, is research. And we sure as heck have no metric for being present in the public debate. But my colleagues and I are deeply committed to this in all sorts of dimensions. So I thought, and I was hired to be the federalism guy. And then 2006, Denise Coury, Saskatchewan resident, was the director of the National Collaborating Center of Healthy Public Policy. And I'd known her when I worked here in Saskatchewan, and she said, could you write a paper on why the government doesn't do what the evidence says the government should do? I paused, thought about it for a minute. Okay, but why would you ask that question in the first place? From a public health perspective, it's a perfectly reasonable question. From a political science question, it's very odd because it assumes that you would expect a relationship between evidence and policy outcomes. So in the middle, I have a picture of a book by Catherine Smith, who now teaches at the University of Strathclyde. Quote, why is policy and evidence safe? Why would you ever assume it would or should be? So political scientists start there. So I spent the last 20 years thinking about not just that question, but what is it about public health or the public health enterprise that would lead you to ask this question in the first place? Deep dive. So then I read Breton and de Leeuw, Healthy Public Policy. And there again, I'm struck by a paradox. In political science, you would never say healthy public policy. You might say public policies that promote health, but the phraseology was odd. Similarly, I discovered the literature on health and all policies, and I went, this is weird. In political science, we would say, most of what you're talking about, by the way, are programs. And what I'm reading is a lot of, this would be a good idea, but I'm not reading a lot of, empirical analysis that it works. And so I discovered that there is a stream in public health that is deeply normative. It describes the world we would like as opposed to the world it is. I have no problem with that. People in political science do this all the time. So as I'm doing all this reading, I discover that there is a community of scholars. The next slide. So I'm beginning to figure out who these people are, and political scientists have just created the International Association of Public Policy, which is sort of interdisciplinary. And this was the second meeting. We meet in Milan, and then one thing leads to another. And then Evelyne and I and a bunch of other people, somewhat by planning, somewhat by accident, we show up on a series of panels, we go for dinner, and we discover that there's a community of scholars, many from public health, some from political science, some from allied disciplines. So Catherine Smith has a degree in social policy, which is a discipline unto itself in the UK. And it was like, wow, we're all more or less doing similar things. And many of us have been confronted with exactly the same question that I was. Why does the government not do what the evidence says the government should do? So there's a beginnings of a literature. Some people do this on a full-time basis, like Paul Kearney. Other of us do it indirectly in different ways. So I said to myself, well, okay, let's see what we can do with this. So for those of you who are playing the grantsmanship game, I have a good news story. On the back of I think $17,000 CIHR workshop grants, we did a whole book. I brought, by some careful planning, because the International Conference on Public Policy was meeting in Montreal, so we did it just before. And big shout out to Stephen Hoffman and my colleagues at Global Strategy Lab. I put a bunch of these people around a table. So Tom McIntosh was there, Evelyne was there, and many of the authors of this book. And we talked through three things: public health, political science, and this use of evidence. So the workshop happens, I think, 2018. We're kind of working, and then pandemic hits. So everything slows down. So the book comes out in 2022. But what we discovered was that there was a commonality, but that we had to build communication, a shared language, as between the different disciplines. So the book is intensely interdisciplinary in that sense, though the language doesn't always meet. But the reason this talk is entitled Political Science in with For is because in the second chapter, there is some work in sociology of medicine that asks, if we're sociologists and we're looking at medicine, are we treating it as something like in a petri dish and we're looking down and observing? Or do we have a more, for lack of a better term, solidarity kind of model? Hi, I'm from sociology. I wish to work with you in medicine to understand what's going on. So I adapted that framework. And I said, what is required is not just a bunch of political scientists looking down at public health and saying, they don't understand Kingdon's theory. That doesn't get anybody anywhere. So instead, I tried to develop this concept of political science with public health. But if there is one way of summarizing where I'm coming from, hi, I'm from political science. I'm a friend. I'm here to help. But by the way, friends tell friends difficult things. So much of what you're going to hear in the next few minutes is some difficult things that the public health enterprise needs to get their head around, because just tough messages. These slides will be available online. If you click in the yellow box, there are some video interviews with Evelyne and I where we tell the story through a longer version of what we just talked about. The next slide.
Yep. So book is here. You can get it online, and then it's free. It's open access. You can buy a print version if you want to have print. If you're old-fashioned like me and you want to have something on your bookshelf, there's 20% off of the price. There's a code here that you can pick up. So come here afterward when we've had our discussion and get the discount, or go online and just get it online.
So the next slide, please. So, whoops, back one slide. So just to bring this part to a close, pandemic hits. And all of a sudden, a bunch of political scientists, oh, there's this thing called public health. Julia Lynch, who teaches at the University of Pennsylvania, described it a little bit as have a pandemic and stir. So there was a lot of writing, which was I'm doing whatever I'm doing as a political scientist, and I'll just add pandemic as a case study, as it were. This is not what we're about. I mean, I'm committed to doing this deeply. So this is just a series of books that have been published in recent years, some of them more recent. But I want to take a minute to talk about this book. The book came out 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, Princeton University Press. The blurb by the publisher, the first and most important analysis of public health by, or at least of COVID, by political scientists. Not, but that's a big blurb. They managed to get themselves an interview with the New York Times. Whereas in epidemiology and the sciences generally, to publish and go into the public square, we have views about research rigor. And if it's more opinion, it takes the form of a commentary or an essay. So for example, I wrote a piece for the Journal of Epidemiology and Community Health at the invitation of the editors, and they didn't know what to call it. So they invented a new category for the journal, and they called it an essay, because it didn't fit the normal way in which public health research goes. In political science, we don't make the distinction in quite that way. So this book, if you open it up, they talk about non-pharmaceutical interventions. Oh, they must know something about public health because they use that public health term. And they have data. They have longitudinal data on rates of death as a result of COVID. And then they conclude that the non-pharmaceutical interventions made no difference. There is enormous public health literature that says that's not true. There's enormous public health literature that says that maybe death is not the best or the only metric. Julia Lynch, who I mentioned a minute ago, is actually writing a whole book on how the way in which countries define death and cause of death is highly variable. So when we use government statistics and try and compare countries, we should do so with a big ounce of caution. And so what I guess my message is, just because a political scientist does public health, it's not necessarily purely an analytic exercise. It could be a more normative exercise. So the book is called How Our Politics Failed Us. And a first quick look says it's an empirical demonstration of that. What the book should be, and it's equally important for this, how those of us who are more suspicious or cautious or concerned about government intervention in people's lives understand COVID. This message is super important for reasons that we'll see a little later, but it is absolutely critical that the public health enterprise take on board and confront directly the fact that reasonable people can disagree on some very basic things.
once more add something to it. This book, How Our Politics Failed Us, politics never fails you. Politics is our construction. So we get the politics we deserve. And then our hopes are, and that's where our talk will end, is that democracy has enough buffering power to get us back on the right track. Nazim, that's but there's a lot of rhetoric in the politics game. There's a lot of rhetoric, policy magic. Some of our friends have called it, where you paint pictures, you use words to frame realities that may not exist, and it is our job, and we hope your job too, eventually, to look through that, and our research actually hopes to accomplish that.
So that's a good segue. So I'm going to take a few minutes to talk about my current research, and then Evelyne will do the same. Go to the next slide, please. So some of you may be familiar, apparently it goes back to Aristotle. It's often attributed to Isaiah Berlin. There are foxes and there are hedgehogs. The hedgehog is the scholar who does one thing, does it deeply, and goes to the bottom of and just does the same thing, but in every greater. And foxes are people who are just curious about the world and jump around. Alan Cairns, a famous Canadian scientist, tried to argue he was a hedge fox. Maybe. I am a fox. Evelyne is a fox, as you'll see in the next few minutes. So, public health advocacy. I have been working on a manuscript for like 3 years now on the concept of public health advocacy. In the competency profiles for most countries, including Canada, advocacy is a competency. As a political scientist, this is very odd. So many years ago, I met a former medical officer of health for the city of Ottawa. And he told the story that he was in the job about a month. And it was the moment when Barack Obama first came to Ottawa and bought a cookie. You may remember Barack Obama goes to the market, buys a cookie. But then, as now, but just on a much lower scale, people had concerns and issues with US foreign policy. And so there was going to be a protest along the route that the motorcade would take. So the medical officer of health arrives at work, and his staff are busy preparing placards. And he goes, "What are you doing?" And he says, they said, we're going to go and join the protest along the parade route. And he went, "But you work for the city. You work for me. Why?" And what that exchange revealed is a disagreement on the place of advocacy in public health. The maximal version is that if you have a maximal definition of public health, everything affects everything else, and therefore our job, and indeed is written in our competency profile, we should go out there and we should advocate for the good. And he pointed out, but you're being paid by the state. This is a bit odd. But forget municipal. It gets even more complicated when you join a provincial or a federal government. When you become a public servant, you sign various oaths. And one of them is you do not engage in public comment unless and until you're the deputy minister, and even then. In Westminster systems especially, public advocacy is the job of the politician. The public servants deliver programs, they provide advice, but they don't go into the public square and they advocate. And the problem is that public health is the exception. The Chief Medical Officer of Health for Canada, the Chief Medical Officer for a province, even local MOHs, have in their mandates to comment on this, that, and the other thing, if they think it is relevant to public health. This does not fit very well, particularly at the provincial and federal level, with our concept of what it means to be a public servant. So this paper, which I will eventually finish, but is now made more complicated by events of the last 6 months, will just kind of point that out. It's not to say one side is right, one side is wrong, but if we're going to teach students to be advocates, we have to think seriously about what that means. And so when I interview chief medical officers and I ask them about advocacy, they say, oh yeah, we advocate, but we do so quietly, not publicly, because we're constrained from doing it publicly. So we need to have a more sophisticated concept of advocacy. Global governance of antimicrobial resistance, very, very, very long story short. The third leading cause of death in the world is now or will soon be antimicrobial resistance. It costs economies around the world hundreds of millions of dollars every year, and it's going to get worse. And if we learned anything during the pandemic, these things have a bad habit of traveling. So a tuberculosis or any disease you want to name becomes resistant to our first-line antibiotics and other medical treatments, because that's the nature of bugs, they evolve. And then we're stuck. It is a collective action problem. So because it's a global collective action problem, we need to act as a global community. So my colleagues and I in the lab, Global Strategy Lab, we've been working on this for a decade. What can we do to galvanize and organize so that we deal with antimicrobial resistance, not just in Canada and not just in hospitals? We take a One Health kind of view, but also we worry about antimicrobial resistance in hospitals and other parts of the community in sub-Saharan Africa or Asia. Because as Canadians, we know SARS, COVID, if you get a disease, antibiotic resistant bug somewhere, it's going to end up here pretty darn quick. So that's a long time project. Science diplomacy. Because of the work we do on global health governance, but also the work I've done in public health governance, what is the story? It's how do we bring scientific evidence to bear? What role does it play in the making of public policy? There is a small literature on science diplomacy, and it's essentially the same question. How do we bring scientific evidence to bear on foreign policy? So they create the chair, I put my hand up. It's a baby chair, so let's not overstate what it's going to do. I have a baby chair, she has a big chair. But the bigger point is, it's the same story. How people genuinely want to know how you bring scientific research to bear, and they have all sorts of different views about what scientific research is, what role it can play. And so in this case, we're doing diplomacy. Next slide. And then just very quickly, in my spare time at 2 in the morning, I worry about this. As my colleague Roland Paris put it, there was today, and then there's after today. The last 2 months have turned our world upside down. In the spirit of, hi, I'm from political science, I'm here to help. Hi, I watch this closely. I and my colleagues are been thinking about governance for a long time, both domestically and globally, and our world has fundamentally changed. The United States, I go to meetings where people routinely say, the United States is no longer a democracy. Think about that. So I'll come back to this at the end. My point is, this crisis is revealing tensions that have always existed. They've just never been spoken out loud in quite the same way. So I strongly recommend, this is, David Foster Wallace has a really good piece in the New York Times 10 days ago. And I'll just use that example before moving on. Public health assumes, the public health enterprise assumes that to maximize health outcomes, we have to do certain things collectively. We've known for a long time that there are other visions of health which focus much more on the individual. What we are witnessing in the United States is a group of very wealthy, sophisticated, connected people who not just define health as something that, like the classic, I go to the hospital and they fix me up view. It's no, I as an individual need to take control of my own health. I need to take the supplements, I need to get the exercise, I need to watch the YouTube videos, and maybe I don't want to even trust the medical establishment because like they're not getting it right. So while we want to pillory RFK Jr., we have to grasp he represents or speaks for or is a window on a large community of people in Canada, in the United States, who have a very different conception of health. But more importantly, they now run things in the federal government of the United States and in many state governments. This conception of health is dramatically different from the one we operate with in public health. And it behooves us to figure this out. So I could go on and on. I better stop and I'll turn things over to Evelyn. We'll come back to this.
We will. Since we caught up yesterday morning at the airport in Toronto, we haven't stopped talking about this. Because the political analysis of this is very different from the public health analysis. But let's go there later. So next slide, which is about my current projects. And the big project is my Chaire d'Excellence de Recherche Canada. But I want to backtrack a little bit to the pandemic, add pandemic and STEHRU. The pandemic broke out, and very quickly I realized that all my work in healthy cities was useless, because none of the cities that I had worked with had any idea of what a respiratory pandemic meant, how they would be able to regulate, enforce, facilitate social distancing, how they would do all those other non-pharmaceutical interventions. Cities don't do public health. There are people who do public health. They have agencies that do public health. Urban administrations don't do public health. They can think about determinants of health, but they don't do pandemics. And so I wrote a little piece in a journal, Cities and Health, and I said cities need to become more aware of this thing called One Health. And there are different versions of One Health. So Patrick has been involved in a very large program of work here in Canada. And AMR, antimicrobial resistance, is only one piece of the One Health puzzle. I'm in a running fight with my friend Trevor Hancock, who says One Health, that's those veterinarians, those clinicians who have a very limited view of the world. What we need to do is planetary health. Why don't you call One Health planetary health? Because that's what matters. And I call it One Health 2.0. Because it does include zoonoses and AMR and food systems, but in the context of ecological balance. And for me, all in the urban environment. So I wrote that little piece and I thought, well, that's typical me. Strange thinking, just bringing in new disciplines, new ideas. Meanwhile, my job, my daytime job was I was the director of the Center for Health Equity Training, Research and Evaluation in Southwest Sydney, one of the most vulnerable, socioeconomically challenged postcodes. That's how they measure things in Australia, in the land. And that district did not cope very well with the pandemic. Imagine you're a family of recent immigrants, 20 people from Syria. You live in a 2-bedroom apartment, 20 of them, 4 generations, and you're being told that you cannot leave your apartment. And then one evening on the television, you see that the hipsters, you know what a hipster is, huh? Men with fancy beards, swaddling a baby, eating macrobiotic food, that's a hipster. So one night you see on televisions that the hipsters are dancing on Bondi Beach. And you think, we can go out, we can dance out in the street. You go out in the street and within minutes, horseback police, armored cars, helicopters, People are being rounded up, arrested, thrown in the slammer, and fined $5,000. Welcome to Australia. I had a discussion earlier this week whether Australia is more racist or Canada. I think Australia wins. But my role as the director of CH&E, the Center for Health Equity Training, Research and Evaluation, was to advise, and I took the public health responsibility seriously there to advise the chief executive of the local health district. And I said, you need to do health equity better. These people who have been picked up by the army are our responsibility, and you have destroyed their trust forever. And she said, yeah, but we did equity because we translated our COVID brochures in 40 languages. How is that equity? So I kept sending the nice memos that you need to do within the bureaucracy. And at one point, I didn't get anywhere. So I wrote a piece in The Conversation. You have that here, website that produces blogs. I wrote a piece in The Conversation and I said, this is the unwillingness of the system to do real equity and acknowledge the challenges of particular populations in this land. And then I get a call from my boss in the university who says, we need to talk about your position. Excellent. I always like that. Positions can only improve. So I talked to him online because this is pandemic, and he says, yeah, we hear that the direction of CH&E has to change. And I say, that's excellent. Throughout my career, I've been in change management. We can change, the direction can change. Go back and figure out what direction they want. And a day later, he calls me back and he says, well, actually, I misunderstood. They don't want the direction of the center to change. They want the director to change. Oops, that was me. So I was fired. I lost all my grants. I lost my staff that was redeployed into contact tracing. And I decided, well, I'm retiring. I'm old enough. This university can't deliver. This country is over. But meanwhile, this idea, this article that I had written about One Health in cities had been picked up by my friends in Montreal who said, this is weird enough for a CERC. And it was incredible. If you have the right friends, people, if you have the right friends, you thrive. These people mobilized resources, artists, a whole bunch, 10 professors who were going to help me write this 700-page application. And I thought it was a strange fantasy. I thought it was never going to fly. And then we got it. So then all of a sudden I had to move to Canada, which was my second home, remember, because I started in Ottawa and I made a lot of friends here doing research with Patrick, writing books. So I arrived 18 months ago, September 2023. 700-page research proposal, of which only 8 pages were the substance. All the rest was policy magic. Look how brilliant we are. So I needed to make a plan. How are we going to spend the millions over the next 8 years? Because my salary doesn't have to be paid out of this grant. The university needs to pay my salary. I have all that money to figure out cutting edge or bleeding edge, even beyond the cutting edge, new ideas. So what are those new ideas? My current projects. One thing that I should add to this, where does political science come in? One Health cities, yeah. We are only ultimately interested in governance. And governance, there's many books written about governance, many definitions given and discussed and debated. Governance really is, what are the rules here? How do we do stuff around here? What is acceptable behavior? What is not acceptable behavior, institutionally, personally? So the governance of One Health in cities. And this is our website. Go and find it out. You can find the team there, 10 professors from 4 faculties, which is fantastic. From very high level, international, 2 branches of the World Health Organization, United Nations Environment Program, Habitat, to very street level. There in Montreal, there is a network, Les Tables de Concertation, which is a community engagement and consultation program. SPHERU is our supporter. And it's not just that they say, yeah, nice idea. No, they actually give us money. This is amazing. This is the commitment is in hard Canadian dollars. So these are some of our projects. Justice and equity in transport with indigenous communities. So we think that mobility is a driver of planetary and One Health issues. And we are committed to working on all of these issues, but especially access to services with First Nations, Métis and Inuit people in Canada. And I will come back to that in the next slide. But it's a thing that I've been doing in Canada, in Australia, in my equity guise. So we work with Kanawake, which is a Kanien'ake community, Mohawk. And we say, look, we have money. We can work with you and do transport justice. But I know from my Australian experience that this white person should not impose on them what I think is clever. They need to speak themselves, and not on my agenda. They need to have their own agenda. So amazingly, instead of working with one community, they say, this is very important, but we need to consult with the other chiefs. So there's an organization of all the chiefs of First Nations in Quebec, and they are having a consultative process. And I say, I trust you. If you need money, organize the thing. Go out, organize, talk, and let us know how transport justice is a thing. Second project here, I'm not going to go through all of these, but the second very interesting thing is biodiversity and how you map biodiversity. So the interesting thing is that we know that biodiversity is good. More biodiversity is better. Sometimes it's scary and threatening. You know, biodiversity in jungles creates new versions of filoviruses like Ebola. But because of the increased biodiversity in those messy environments, the threat is also better managed. In cities, interestingly, we have weeded out, literally, biodiversity. Cities are concrete. There's very little biodiversity. And the biodiversity that there is, you don't see. It's fungi. It's in the water underground. And we don't know anything about that. So there's a treaty on biodiversity. And the Conference of Parties Secretariat is in Montreal. It's 400 people thinking about biodiversity right on our doorstep. So I go to that secretariat and I say, how do you measure biodiversity? Because there's a whole treaty on it. And they say, yeah, well, we don't. We just talk about it. Policy magic. So we say, so what would it mean to actually to map biodiversity for political purposes, for governance purposes? If I want to improve the biodiversity of cities so that they become more resilient, more responsive, more active in planetary terms, what would you need to do in order to get the data and the interface with the politics? And we found that there's satellite data already existing. So the satellites measure chlorophyll, for instance. And in discussing this with our partners of the Insectarium, they say, chlorophyll and insect life have something to do with each other. And they run sentinel sites of insects across the Île de Montréal, the island of Montreal. And you can have the citizen science insect data and interlace them with satellite data on chlorophyll and create a map that shows from street corner to street corner how healthy the biodiversity of that place is. And we're going to work with the political leadership of the different arrondissements and show them on this street corner, your city is dead. And here it works. Now, we have people who would want to work with you and plant trees or help people run little gardens in the front of their house or engage, transform the environment. which is, I think, this is everything One Health in cities should be about. Our big strategic program of work is La Ville Souterrain. Montreal, as you know, if you've been there, has a big underground city. You can walk, the 22 metro stations are connected. There's thousands of people traveling into the city and out of the city every day, and they never leave a contained environment. Now, this is a fantastic greenhouse for disaster. Climate change, a few centigrades of climate change, mosquitoes in the underground city. A little bit of a flood, well, all sorts of bad organisms erupting, but even man-made ones, toxins. You know, imagine what would happen. How would we understand the governance of the vertical city? Because it's not just underground, it's all those towers too. And that's an abstract question. If we started talking to all the people in Montreal and said, what about the governance? How do you prepare for emergencies in the underground city? And they all started pointing at each other. So, oh, that's the fire brigade. And the fire brigade said, no, it's the metro. The metro said, no, it's the city of Montreal. And the city of Montreal said, we have, in case of a disaster, we have an organism that we can convene within minutes. Who are they? Where will they sit? What will they do? How do they map out the complexity of this city? Well, you know, we have maps, paper, showed me paper. We have maps of the underground city. Yes, some of the underground city is 40 floors high. What do you know about 40 floors high? So we have a staged approach to 8 years of investing in the governance of the underground city. And it's fantastic. Just by having these wild ideas, people will join us. So from the original group of professors from 4 faculties, we are now looking to recruit other people from the Faculty of Law, for instance. One of the interesting things that we see in law is that there are countries on this world, and Canada is moving in that direction, where natural phenomena have legal status. A river can speak, and a river can take humanity to court. In fact, on the South Island of Aotearoa, New Zealand, a river has won a court case against the government. Now, wouldn't that be lovely? Or not? I don't know, but this is typical One Health. Next. Sylvia also said that I still hold a very small appointment with the University of New South Wales in Sydney, because even though I hated them when I left and I thought they were all idiots and racists, I'm involved in the Gabadi Gaduda project. And this is fantastic. And I really hope to replicate this with Indigenous people here in Canada. We know that country is an important concept for Indigenous people. For Indigenous people, you are one with country. You can't own country. You may be territorial, but you can't own country. You are country. If you're taken away from that country, which has happened, you know, our invaders have done that on purpose since they invaded, you lose your connection to well-being. The evidence is out there. The epidemiology is very clear that disconnecting from country is bad for Indigenous people's health. Our question was, can you restore that connection? What would be required to bring back that connection to country? Bring back connection to elders, to ancestors, to the cosmos. And what we did, and as the boss of Chetra, I created the space. I did not determine this. I just created the space for our Indigenous colleagues to run this and do whatever they said to me was right. And they said, we need to go camping. And so camping as a scientific method. So we camp in those places up there called Narran Lakes with people from those mobs. We don't call them tribes or bands. We call them mobs. And we can show that camping, camps for men, camps for women, camps for children, camps for old people, that in fact improves the health of people. It improves the resilience. It improves the capacity to ask for help. It makes health better of Indigenous people. So the second stage of this program is, can you formalize this approach? You all know the concept of social prescribing. You know, that you say, go rest, go exercise, walk in nature, have a forest bath in Japan. We want, and Australia may be different from Canada, but we want a Medicare code that allows doctors to prescribe for a fee connection to country. Go back to country and be whole again. Is this possible? How would you do it? And then as a very small spin-off, and then I'm going to stop because I could talk for days about this. Some people are so disconnected from country that they cannot go back on a camp. If you are dying, if you're in intensive care, and you're not on country, you will, that's the cosmology of Indigenous people, you will die a bad death. First of all, you need your community around you, and most ICUs are not built for large community groups. That can be facilitated. But if you're not connected to country, you cannot move with the forefathers, with the ancestors. Can you facilitate that? So what we did with a whole bunch of artists and technologists and clever people, we scanned this environment. We had an army of drones, or an air force of drones, map all of this at very high resolution, and people in their dying moments, in hospital beds, in ICU, can use virtual reality goggles and be back on country. And the community around them says that when they pass more peacefully than if they would not have had that experience. Now, and I think this is, it moves me very much on the one hand. On the other hand, this is terrible. Is this technology going to save lives? Is this really good? Are we going to give everybody virtual goggles to return to country? So there's moral and political questions there as well. But I just want to mention it because I think we should try to do that here in Canada as well. Then, this is a harmony talk. This is nice. We're discovering nice things. Back to you, Patrick. Next slide.
So we should have probably done this in different order because you're supposed to end on a good news story. But I want to go back to what I was talking about, my current obsession. And I just want to end with what strikes me about the time we're in. Because Evelyne and I live at the border between the public health enterprise and political science, my social media feed, the tables of contents that into my inbox, they could be public health journals, they could be political science journals, the blogs that I read. And on the public health side, I get a whole lot of, well, we're just going to pretend it's not happening. And to the extent that people engage, you get responses like more science. So if the US government is taking an axe to the National Institutes of Health, well, we just have to show them all the good things that that scientific research is doing and convince them that it's a mistake. So similarly, well, if trust in public health officials is down, well, we just have to be really transparent, because we all know that that's how you build trust. You're transparent with your interlocutors. Or we need to make the public health function independent from those politicians, because like politics is icky and getting ickier by the moment. So, we free the CDC or something. And then finally, well, if we can show all the benefits that come from investments in public health, surely they'll change them. Because the problem is not principally public health, or it is indirectly. Because when I go talk and read blogs and go to meetings and talk to political science, it's like the cuts to the to Health and Human Services yesterday, 10,000 people across CDC, FDA, et cetera, you would be forgiven for thinking that it was about health. But it's not necessarily or primarily about that. It is part of a much bigger political project that the contours of which we're just now trying to get our head around. When I said earlier that public health has become a political football, it's never more clear than in the United States. Although in New Zealand, I didn't tell you this story. The public health, medical officer of health in New Zealand does what medical officer of health does, and he comments on some development. And the conservative politicians go bananas and start talking about those nincompoops from public health. What business do they have? Their job is to just protect us from infectious disease, and like they should just shut up. Thereby saying out loud what historically would not have been said, because they know that there is this distrust, is putting it nicely. But in the United States, it's even more strong. You get people saying out loud, well, when there's the next pandemic, not clear that we should do the way, I mean, if it means, you know, some elderly people will die, well, that's just, because, well, health equity, what's that? No, it's about power. More importantly, I hear a lot, well, this too shall pass. The public will react, and they'll put pressure on the politicians, and the politicians will change their mind. Martin McKee is a very famous public health scholar in Europe and in the UK. He wrote a piece in the BMJ in December and about the ending of funding for the World Health Organization. And the opening statement was, plan for the worst, hope for the best. I think, oh, good. They go through the analysis. And then the final paragraph is, well, thank goodness it's only going to last 4 years, and eventually Trump and co will be gone. So I wrote a letter to the BMJ and they published it. And I said, no. It's much, much, much worse than that. You're assuming, for example, that there will be elections, or if there are, they will be free and fair. I was at a meeting 3 days ago, and when the question was put, will the midterm elections in the United States be free and fair? The best I could come up with was 60-40. Then the question was put, will there be elections? And there were a bunch of people who said, no, it's not outside the realm of possibility that there won't be elections in the US, at least, and they certainly won't be fair. But most importantly, and this is the one that we in Canada are on the pointy end of the stick of what political scientists call the end of the rules-based international order. The Trump tariffs that are turning the Canadian economy upside down and sideways, that is a symptom of something much bigger. We've built the global public health institutions that we have since World War II, and especially since, say, the early 90s, based on a set of assumptions about the way the international system works. And Iona Kickbush wrote 2 weeks ago, the end of the golden era of global health diplomacy is over. Why? Because we did all those cool things. We addressed famine in sub-Saharan Africa. We built mechanisms of surveillance. We tackled or tried to tackle infectious disease outbreaks. We almost came close to eliminating polio, but it was in an environment that was stable. We didn't have to worry about global wars. We could assume the American government was going to be there. And by the way, the US government funded a lot of all of those activities. That's gone. PEPFAR, which saved millions of people suffering from HIV/AIDS in sub-Saharan Africa and Asia, is gone. It's gone. And if it comes back, it will come back as a fraction of its former self. And this is bigger than Donald Trump. I hate to be like an Eeyore, but hi, I'm from political science, I'm here to help. We need to understand the nature of the political change that's confronting us. So I'll end on this point and then we'll take questions. My standard pattern for the last decade has been public health needs and has the ability to understand the policy process. And no, it's not about evidence-based policy. And I have a standard pattern. You and I have done this a million times. Now, not only is the challenge to understand the policy process, but it's to understand politics. Now, good news. Let's do a division of labor. Over in political science, that's what we do, and we do it pretty well. But we have to build structures like this conversation to allow that dialogue to happen. And the good news is our universities at their best promote interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary research, but we all know it's really hard because we go into rooms and we're not even talking the same language. So we need to work at that. And on a positive note, if there is positive, it will come from the bottom. I teach my MPH students, public health began local, is local, a lot of the heavy lifting happens local, and stuff can happen in the stratosphere, but local people will organize as they always have, right? So there's a fundamentally a good news story there. It may be harder than it used to be, so that's going to continue. And there's also the possibility, and this is a big if, that civil society in the United States and beyond will push back hard. So I'll leave you with this question. Will the United States be like Hungary, where you have, what's the political science term we use? Essentially, it's a democratic shell. So there are elections, but not really. There's a free press, but not really. Very depressing vision. Or will the United States be like Poland, where you get an authoritarian government, it lasts for a certain number of years, and then by some process, it is overthrown. We can hope for the second, but we should anticipate the possibility of the first. And in Canada, it's not like happening over there, because when I say that this message in Western Canada, I think it has more resonance. All of us have friends and family who are deeply interconnected with the US media environment. We all know people who exclusively consume Fox News or stuff like that. So in Canada, and in Saskatchewan in particular, I think we kind of get it, that we're vulnerable, because our friends and neighbors truly are paying attention to what's going on there, and some of them really like it. So we have to get our act together and fast, because Canadian political institutions are, we'll find out, but I think better built and therefore more durable. And it was, I can go on a great length as to why things happening in the United States the way they are. It kind of was a black swan moment, but we're all vulnerable. So we have to think about that. So I'll stop there.
Oh, good news.
That's probably a good.
Thank you so much. That is deeply thought-provoking, and I know there will be questions, but what I'd like to do is bring Tom McIntosh in as a bit of a discussant for us. So Tom, I'm going to turn the floor over to you and hear your response to what you've heard this afternoon.
Thank you, Sylvia, and thank you, Nazim, for the invitation to do this today. I'm very sorry I can't be there in person. Welcome to life in Saskatchewan in March. We got storm stayed. Just as a very quick aside, in terms of a story about equity and justice in transportation, I'd like to ask Patrick over dinner to explain to Evelyne how this little thing called the Saskatchewan Transportation Corporation used to be integrated into a huge number of aspects of daily life in the province of Saskatchewan. It's a perfect illustration of the idea of transportation, as my colleague Bonnie Jeffrey would always say, is a key determinant of health. It's a real pleasure to be here to offer the sort of first response to this presentation. It was, as Sylvia said, incredibly thought-provoking and filled me with all sorts of things to do. Patrick sent me the slides in advance, but if you've looked at the slides without the context, trying to come up with many notes in advance was a bigger challenge than I could meet. So I've been madly typing. And so what you're about to get is a series of random thoughts thrown back out at Evelyne and Patrick. As Sylvia said in the introduction, I've known Patrick now for over 30 years in a whole range of capacities. I think the work he does in the relationship between public health and politics and political science is truly important. I've known Evelyne's work for a very long time, and she's consistently insightful and thought-provoking and so much fun. We follow each other on social media, so I get to see her often funny, often quirky posts there, and I'm a huge fan. And it's because of this that I jumped at the chance to attend the symposium at York that Patrick spoke about that became their edited collection. It was a really remarkable event because it saw this group of very bright people, to which Patrick added me, really grappling with some really important, challenging attempts to sort of operationalize that idea of what does it mean for public health to take politics seriously, and at least much more seriously than it has in the past. And I was struck throughout the talk, and especially in Evelyne's introduction, in talking about things like healthy cities and healthy public policy and the role of the local level, how important this talk is for us at a place like SPHERU, where for 25 years we've really striven to work with our local communities across the province, Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities, urban and rural communities, older communities and young communities, and to really think about what it means to build health at the local level and to change policy at the local level and to influence policy at the local level. So SPHERU really may be evidence, I hope, of Kit Bush's assertion that public policy or that healthy public policy, if it doesn't work at the national level, it may work at the local level. And also, Evelyne, thank you for calling out the misuse and bad use of kingdom, especially with regard to health. This is something that has bothered me for a very long time. And as, again, for Patrick's idea about being present in the public debate, again, there's a real resonance for us at SPHERU, because that's what we've worked very hard to do again for the last 25 years, is to be as present as we can in the local debate and especially the provincial debate. So in particular, as I relate to the idea of what it means to embed political science in public and population health, I've spent 22 years in SPHERU as a political scientist among an incredible diversity of different types of researchers, and that struggle to find that common language by which we can teach each other about what we understand about public health is very real, I think, to all of us in the unit. And I would say my name is on papers in journals that most political scientists don't even know exist. Patrick is nodding. You too, I suspect as well. And I suspect that a lot of my fellow political scientists look at me and say, what you do isn't political science anymore, to which I don't really care. I'm a full professor, I have tenure, I can do what I want. And I enjoy doing that. And I think there is that challenge about what does it mean to take politics seriously. It's a challenge of taking not just politics seriously, but taking political science seriously. And as I've said to Patrick on more than one occasion, I think there's a difference between the two. When public health researchers, whether they're epidemiologists or anthropologists or nutritionists or nurse researchers, take politics seriously, they often, as one of the slides says, fall into that trap of seeing politics as a bug. It is, I think, you can paraphrase Katharine Hepburn from the African Queen. Politics is what we are put in this earth to rise above. And that seems to be the approach that we see too often. But when you take political science seriously is when you, I think, understand, as I think Patrick and Evelyne have demonstrated in their work, that politics is actually a feature of public health. It is baked into it, and it cannot and it shouldn't be escaped from. And I think we still see that in the slide that they had about the crisis in public health. More science, make public health independent of government, tell everyone how valuable what we do is. Those are all responses that take politics seriously, but see politics as a threat to public health. And I'm not saying that public health isn't under threat in the political system, but it's under threat not just because of what it does and what it says. It's under threat, as Patrick said near the end, because the very foundations of the social and political order that supports public health is under threat. And of course, nowhere is that more visible than it is in the United States. It's also worth mentioning that there's a very big threat to public health science and public health advocacy that hasn't been mentioned yet, which is the acquiescence in the United States of major universities to the demands of the Trump administration with regards to things like DEI, the types of scientific inquiry, to the very nature of what it means to be a university. That itself is a massive threat, not only in the US, but I think across the world. Indeed, just the other day, there's an op-ed in the New York Times that argued that universities like Columbia and Harvard actually have at their disposal tens of billions of dollars in their endowments that they could be spending in order to tell the Trump administration to go to hell and to backstop the work of their researchers. They could insulate themselves. They are choosing not to do so. Today, the American Psychological Association voluntarily withdrew its DEI initiatives before they were even asked to. They are moving in advance of being told by the Trump administration, and that is truly problematic. And so I'd like to ask Evelyne and Patrick both to say something really about the role that universities have to play in the political battles, not only over public health, but in the battle for the persistence of that democratic governance. And similarly around the role of advocacy in that. Again, Patrick's work around the role of public health officers during COVID and all of that. We've had many discussions, many email exchanges, a couple of late night bourbons in hotel rooms at conferences discussing that work. And I'd like Patrick to say a little bit more about how that has changed and why it may be more acute now than even it was at the time of COVID. I was struck also at the end by Evelyne discussing in her own work around being in the country and camping and the like. There's a piece coming out in a book I'm editing that makes a case that in Western Canada, at least for Indigenous people, there's this growing move to use encampments and what are deemed to be illegal placings of encampments on the land as a new form of kind of radical democratic Indigenous politics to challenge government policy around Indigenous health and well-being. So I'd really love to see how that work of hers is going to transpose itself into Canada. And finally, we come to the end of the talk where Patrick tried his damnedest to be positive. And I think his diagnosis is spot on. I think there is a bigger political project at play to which we have to turn our attention. But it leaves me to a number of kinds of questions, because one of the possibilities I think that we are facing is that post-war system was actually the exception and not the rule. That most of our history was not that post-war stable world where we could do what we did. Most of our world is looking like that bleak future that is being hinted at today. That is most of our history. Um, and so that instability is something, and it leads me to the question to sort of quickly respond, will the US be Hungary or will the US be Poland? I really do want to ask, are those the only choices we have? Do we have other choices to be something other than a Hungary or Poland? And finally, again, to go back to, because we're gathered, me at the University of Regina and everyone else at the University of Saskatchewan, are our universities up to that role that Patrick and Evelyne sort of put for them at the end? Because Patrick, you think you may have been an Eeyore. I think I'm even more Eeyore-ish than you are on that, because I'm not sure from where I sit that even our public universities in Canada are up to the kinds of challenge. But I want to thank you for just an amazing survey of both what you guys have done and what you've accomplished, and the importance that you've highlighted about taking politics and political science seriously in what we do in public health, and for giving us just a whole ton of stuff to think about. And I know there's going to be a billion questions, so I'm going to leave my rambling, not terribly well focused, and quickly written comments and turn it back over to you guys and to Sylvia to handle the Q&A. But thank you very much for what was just an amazing talk.
Thank you, Tom. That was a really lovely overview. Again, bringing some ideas forward and some questions. And I just wanted to turn to Patrick and Evelyne to see if you had some immediate responses to Tom, and then we'll open up for a bit of a Q&A.
My most immediate response directly to your question, Tom, what the role of university should be. Well, we whether we want it or not, we are the cradle of the resistance. I've always believed, and I think we should really stand up for that we are not to regurgitate knowledge, because that's what we often do in teaching. We are to advance knowledge, and you can only advance knowledge by being critical and think outside the box. And I think what I've shown about my projects is that I hope to be a bit of a role model in thinking outside the box, that public health is more than epidemiology, as we all know, but that you can go as far as connecting anthropology and satellite data. Why not? Let's think about it. Is it possible or not? And in fact, this June, I will be speaking at the International Healthy Campuses Conference in Limerick, where I will make exactly this point, that freedom of thought, freedom of expression, essentially the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, has a home, and that is in universities. And I think we need to be more activist and more advancing the ideals of what I believe is a universal truth, and not just an ideal that once existed, and that is now being violated, not just, I should say, by our southern neighbors. This is a global conspiracy. So the backers of Project 2025 that drives the current deterioration of the United States, their purpose, their theory of change is to is regime change everywhere in the world. They're behind Argentina, Milei. They are behind the support of dictatorships in Africa. Museveni used to be in Uganda a champion of emancipatory HIV/AIDS programs. Right now, you can be put to death if you are gay in Uganda. That is not his choice. that has been provided to him by the American Heritage Foundation and the funding that they provided for his agenda. And this happens all over the world. So don't just look at Trump and his cronies. There's a larger problem, and our universities, in our networks, in our collaborations, need to stand up for this. Now, I should end maybe on my new university, the Université de Montréal, which in fact, I think has a far more progressive stance on these things than my previous universities in Australia. And whether that is because they're a unionized university and have a fairly radical approach to what should be feasible in science and technology, I don't know. Yesterday we got an email telling us, if you travel to the United States, protect yourself, because they're going to get you. Now, of course, we know that, but it's good that our institution tells us that. And it shows that they're aware of the threats.
I'll be very short because I know we should get to Q&A. On the 22nd, 23rd of April, the U7 plus group of universities will meet at the University of Ottawa. The U7 plus is a group of universities mostly in Europe and in North America who began on the proposition that when the G7 meets, the G7 being the group of high-income countries that meets periodically. This year, the G7 is meeting here in Canada. Canada holds the G7 presidency. So the U7 has been now U7 plus in this habit of, well, we'll meet in the spring of that year, and we will discuss and release diagnostics advice to the G7. I had never heard of the U7 plus until about 6 weeks ago, which should tell you something. And the premise, the reason that I got roped into it, Patrick, we'll do this cool thing. We'll on the margins of that, we'll do this conversation about science diplomacy. What I fear is we'll get universities doing policy stuff, like the G7 should do this on poverty and this other thing on climate change, and just not pay attention to the elephant. And hey, we all want to do that. In the face of having your world turned upside down, it is tempting to just, go home, hide under a pillow and pretend it's not happening. So one response of universities is just to abstract themselves and pretend it's not happening. We'll see. But getting consensus will be fun to watch. But I have just turned my mind to thinking, so what role do universities play? And we have a very anemic conversation in Canada about the social and political role of universities. Never has really occurred to us. We've never debated it. We probably have different views. But the difference between Harvard and the University of Saskatchewan, or between Columbia and the University of Ottawa, is we're public universities. We're deeply vulnerable. So we don't have the same marge de manœuvre, the same room to maneuver as they might. But more than that, like what role do universities play? So I'll just end on this observation. In newspapers all the time, you will read, today, a study from the University of Saskatchewan said, but of course, it's absurd. The University of Saskatchewan didn't write it. Researchers at the University of Saskatchewan. So we've allowed this tendency to say, well, universities write papers and take views. That's not how it works at all. The test will come when you say something truly controversial. Will your university stand up for you? I think that in Canada, we're going to have a relatively easy time of it in the short term, but it's only a matter of weeks before I or one of my colleagues in the Graduate School of Public and National Affairs says something untoward about the Trump administration, and some nervous bureaucrat in Global Affairs Canada is going to write the university and say, that will not go over well. My colleagues and I will not react well. We were given a mandate to be present in the public debate, and just when the public debate gets hard is not the time to tell us to sort of take it easy. Maybe I'm wrong, maybe it won't happen that way, but it's very unstable, so who knows? But stay tuned, it'll be fun. I'll stop there.
Thank you. So interesting. I am going to open it up to Q&A here. Just wanted to note a couple of comments that came in while you were talking. One was an oh no when you talked about it wasn't the center, it was the director. And this really links to what you just had to say, Patrick, in an interesting way. And another person who talked about having worked on a project in the Northwest Territories where mental health was improved by using virtual reality as well, similar to the project there. So we will also take questions online. I'm going to look in the room first and give you guys online time to talk or put up your hands. Yeah, I'll run around with the mic. So, Nazim will do that and I'll monitor the chat. Thank you.
Questions?
Hello, my name is Fernanda André. Thank you so much for the wonderful presentations and talk you just delivered. I understand that there has been quite a lot of a considerable amount of investment around the world in terms of strategies to improve health and well-being of individuals. I'm thinking of the SDGs, the Healthy People 2020, and today I just learned about the One Health in cities, or One Healthy Cities. When you think about us achieving planetary health, is it possible? Is it achievable? And if so, do you have one tip or a suggestion that you think it's a way that universities, us as students, as future leaders can sort of like mimic, emulate, and be able to achieve planetary health? Thank you.
I don't know why, but the way you phrased your question, so let me tell a positive story. The difference between now and almost any other time is that we have data and information and knowledge freely circulating, and so we know more. We have greater data about what can be accomplished. So, I mean, let's not forget that partly through public health, but not only, rates of absolute poverty in the world are way down, right? The SDGs and their predecessors, we have measurable progress in any number of dimensions. I don't think that's going to disappear tomorrow just because the United States government goes bananas. So there is in civil society, including universities, both capacity and interest and enthusiasm for doing stuff. Right? When I first discovered the concept of global health, it took me a long time to realize that when I thought global health and global health governance could be put in the same sentence. And what I realized was a lot of what gets done under the rubric of global health is very similar to what we used to call international health. I'm going to practice medicine in an LMIC. That's both a good news story and a bad news story. It's a good news story in the sense that real people in real places will continue to want to make things better in a medical way as they have been doing for decades. So that is not going to end tomorrow. The risk or the instability comes from, since World War II, you were able to do that because you could assume a certain degree of stability. You could assume a certain amount of wealth that would allow you to go, et cetera, et cetera. That's not going to disappear tomorrow. but we're about to find out. As my colleague Roland Paris put it, the old world order is dead, the new world order is being born, and it's chaotic, and nobody has a real clear vision of what it's going to look like. It could be better, it could be worse, but civil society will do what civil society has always done, and it just will be, we're about to find out, with more and less constraints. Whether and what role universities play, that's a really interesting question. I don't know. I could be optimistic, I could be pessimistic, but we haven't actually put, at least in Canada, we haven't put our universities to the test yet, as has happened in the United States. That will happen sooner rather than later.
Wow.
Oh, did you want to respond?
Yeah. I'm going to be I'm going to give a very depressing answer. The answer is no. Give up. Trust yourself and no one else. And find people like you that you can do it together with. And you know, it's a chaotic world, and it may be depressing. But I'm reminded of the work, a small bit of work by my friend Anne-Emmanuelle Byrne from the University of Toronto. She's a historian of public health, and edited the textbook for global health, I think it was, with a fairly radical agenda, different from the international health, which is scary diseases in warm countries. But her key piece of work that I admire is the story of smallpox eradication. And so this is an act of heroism. The World Health Organization exists because of smallpox eradication. We've done it. The world came together and we eradicated smallpox. In her analysis, we nearly did not eradicate smallpox. And it was for very strange reasons that ultimately there was a last push funded by the Swedish government that eradicated the last cases. Now, the story is that there were surveillance programs, the technology worked, smallpox vaccinations were possible because of the invention of the bifurcated needle. It was easy to achieve cold chain technology and get it to the right places, all of that. So actor network theory, Bruno Latour, explained everything, why this was going to happen. There was a small pocket of smallpox in the world that still posed a risk. And as long as you haven't eradicated it, everybody's still at risk. Now, that small pocket was in East Africa. It was in Ethiopia and Ethiopia, there was a pocket, Ethiopia, Somaliland, and Somalia. And the only explanation why it was there was because in the balance of power that existed during the Cold War between the United States and its allies and the Soviet Union and its allies, this was territory that wasn't claimed by anyone because they believed that there was nothing there. There was no strategic advantage of being aligned with that dry bit of highland in East Africa. And so they didn't give shit. They didn't send their teams there, and smallpox eradication, yeah, you know, we've nearly done it. It can wait for a little while. Until the Swedish government stepped in and said, no, we got to do this. We have to do it. If you read Anne-Emmanuelle's account of what happened there, this was warfare. This was in the back rooms of the World Health Organization. They try to convince each other that the other bloc had to step up, and it was definitely nasty and unpleasant politics. The fact that the Swedes stepped in with a relatively minor sum of money, a couple of million, showed some real commitment to public health that we often don't see. Now, why do I tell this story? The world has become more chaotic. As Patrick said, there are currently no more clear power blocks. America wants to have the power everywhere, but they're destroying the everywhere. PEPFAR is gone, people will die. NIH grants are gone, people will die. USAID, still in doubt. There's now a judge that said it was an illegal cancellation, but no, exactly, gone. So the United States believes this, and others, some of their allies believe that they for trade and control, they need to see the world as their marketplace. But at the same time, they brutally let people die. And no one really steps in. The Soviet Union is gone. Russia is gone, can't do it. China, I don't see having any opportunity to actually do it. Although with the Belt and Road Initiative, they slowly created the logistics. But they never expressly said anything about health and well-being. We discussed that yesterday. Belt and Road has no health agenda. So we are lost. But stay optimistic, please. Please.
Thank you. Remy, I can see you're still online and you have a question in the chat. I didn't know if you just wanted to open your mic and introduce yourself and ask your question. Perhaps not. I'll read the question. This is the one that's in the, oh, no problem. Thanks, Remy, will do. Thanks for a simulating presentation, Patrick. As a person who has worked in the global health space for over a decade, it has been a challenging couple of months. The COVID pandemic was a stress test on the public health enterprise, and I wonder if we failed to understand the significance of damaging mis- and disinformation on a global scale. My question is, where did we go wrong in the global health ecosystem? What are the missed opportunities to have prevented the current disaster, and what can still be done?
It's a very good question. And Remy, with great respect, it's the wrong question. The question presumes that the dismantling of the global health structures that we've built up is driven by something about health. Or that the people in global health, if they had done something differently, the outcome would be different. The United States' dramatic change in US foreign policy, A, is bigger than Trump, has been brewing for at least a couple of decades, and C, the effects on public health are a second order consideration. The first order consideration is we have a different vision of what the world should look like. It's a world of sort of 19th century style blocks of countries. The fact that there are effects on global health may be interesting, but that's not why we did it. We're doing it for much bigger geopolitical reasons. And so, no, there's nothing that public health actors or global public health or the WHO could have done, because what we're seeing is a symptom of something bigger. But the broader point I'm trying to make is that if you try and understand the world solely through a public health lens, you will then, if I have a hammer, everything's a nail. If I have expertise in public health, I understand the world through a public health lens, which is incredibly insightful at times, but this may not be one of those times, or it may be insufficient unto the day. So hi, we're from political science. We have other lenses. Let's work together so we understand what we're facing. And just the punchline of what Evelyne was saying might be, on a per capita basis, Norway spends more on public health than almost all other high-income countries. And it is now deeply embedded in Norwegian politics. You get parties to the right, parties to the left, and right-wing parties in Norway are pretty right-wing. But this commitment to global public health is pretty deep. That's going to continue because Norway is a very wealthy place, so they have capacity. So that's the good news story. I think whether it's Sweden or Norway, there will be actors. They will be constrained. They're going to be spending a lot of money on defense, but there will be a lag effect that might last for a goodly long time. Let me just give you yesterday, the United States announced that it was terminating its funding for Gavi, the Global Alliance for Vaccine. What is I? Anybody know the I in Gavi? Doesn't matter. What is Gavi? Gavi is basically a global cooperation of public-private partnership to make vaccines available. 2 weeks ago, the government of Canada announced a new tranche of funding for Gavi. So you can be like me and focus on the bad thing, or you can be somewhat more optimistic and say, well, some countries, at least in the short term, are stepping up and saying, no, this is still important. And so I think, if only just to sleep at night, we should focus on the Norways and on the Canadian announcement, because that's going to continue for a while yet anyway.
Hi, Thelina Banderas, School of Public Health. I have a question. So first of all, I need to go back, and I'm a big fan of writing about Kingdon, so I need to go back and see how wrong I got it. I've used it a lot, so but this question's kind of along the lines of that. I ask as someone who studies public health policy and as an educator, we think we teach a lot about policy. I maybe don't understand, or I haven't been told in the right way what the difference is between policy studies and where politics isn't being fit in properly. Because I've taken a lot of policy classes in my public health training, but we didn't talk about politics. So what are we doing wrong in teaching health policy in general to the detriment of teaching politics?
The University of Ottawa created a master's degree in public health in 2019, and we were the last of a wave, right? So post-SARS, we got MPHs popping up all over the country. I was on the planning committee, and we said, well, does Canada just need another MPH program? And the answer was, well, probably not. And so we did a survey, to your point, and we asked the question, well, we're in Ottawa. The University of Ottawa strategic plan says we're in Ottawa, and so we should probably be policy or government oriented. So what would that look like? So we did a survey of MPH programs across the country, and we asked the question, do they teach policy? And if so, how they do it? And I'm take this with a grain of salt because I'm doing this from memory, but what we discovered was the people who were tasked with teaching, quote, the policy course, were this motley collection of people who understood program evaluation, or they were health economists, or they were various other disciplines. But in Canada, unlike the United States, almost never a political scientist. I'm not here to claim that the only people who can explain the policy process are political scientists, on the contrary. But I am here to say that if you do it in the traditional way, you're going to take somebody whose research is a piece of the bigger puzzle, but not the puzzle itself. I studied the puzzle itself. Difference between policy and politics. If you come from if you're an economist or a program evaluator, or maybe you do health promotion and you've done policy work for the government, or you used to work for the government, whatever, you are really good at talking about programs and program design, but that's not the same thing as policy. So when we teach the policy process, we put the political system and governance front and center. And we start, instead of bottom up, it's top down. So my students, they get to, like we run them through parliament, federalism, cabinet decision-making, and all the way to implementation. And the students say, well, this seems all macro. So then we give very concrete examples. This is 180 degrees from the way policy is often taught in public health schools. So, but from a public health context, that was not terrible. because until the pandemic, the political problem was smallish. Yes, there were always people who didn't like vaccines, but they were relatively small in number. Yes, there were people who weren't sure that we should be spending money on redistributing income because income inequality is the single biggest determinant of health, but they were relatively small in number. That's gone. We now live in a world where the standard things that public health has done and always wants to do are now contested. And more importantly, they've become political footballs. Monsieur Poilievre will go into the public square and offer a different version of how to deal with the opioids crisis. And I've seen him give this speech so often now, and I've followed the debate, I can actually give that part of his speech for him. But where he drives me crazy is he then goes the next step and he says, the people on the other side who are about harm reduction, he paints that group in a very, very pejorative, negative way. So it's no longer the way we normally teach policy studies. Groups of people disagree, coalition building, it's all that. But it's got this political overlay that is much more pronounced in the United States. Now, to give equal opportunity or equal criticism, if the University of Michigan Press finally gets its act together, sometime in the next few months, a book will appear on vaccine politics from around the world. And I, with some colleagues, wrote the Canada chapter. And in that chapter, we document how in the 2021 election, vaccine mandates were what we call a wedge issue. But make no mistake about it, it was the Liberal government of Mr. Trudeau that decided that it would be fun to run an election campaign on around vaccine mandates. So it's not like it's just the right that's playing this game. I mean, it was a very, and Mr. O'Toole, the then leader of the Conservative Party, has since said more than once, that killed us politically. It was very clever, even though he didn't like it. This is a new world for public health. So the takeaway is, you not only have to have the policy process and program evaluation, all that good stuff, but it's now, sorry, make your reading list or your task list longer. You have to be much more aware of how politics works. And it's hard, but it's not impossible. If I can teach myself enough public health to get appointed to a medical school, you can figure out politics, right? There's some basic things. But most importantly, let's do it together. Let's create coalitions and partnerships and do a division of labor. Don't ask me to lead the protest, because I'm not terribly disciplined when I speak, and I'm always get something wrong. But we know people that we want to send to the front of the protest. Let's do what each of us were good at. So some of us, it will be advocacy, some will be protest, and some of it will be, writing essays, trying to understand the nature of the problem. Let's do that. Right? And that ultimately is the medium to long-term story. Let us build those coalitions. But I'm sorry, public health can no longer treat politics as a bug, treat politics as the thing that's between us, between evidence and action. I have spent much too much of the last decade saying, no, politics is the way societies resolve their disagreements. It's not a side effect. It's not something, as much as it's weird and their politicians are crazy and they say dumb things, the alternative is worse. So politics is not just something that you can dismiss or gets in the way of evidence-based policymaking. It is how we make decisions in a democratic society. I preach this and more or less I get listened to, but how we think about public health is going to have to change because our world is more unstable. And so we need to do better as opposed to the stuff we were now doing on the margins. So we have one MPH program where they have to come take policy courses. They should all have that. But it requires the medical school to talk to the faculty of arts or social science, and it's complicated. And we all have the scars to prove it, but it can be done.
Let me add to this. The Anglo-Saxon world is different from other areas in the world. So when I first arrived in Australia, and I became head of school of the School of Health and Social Development, one of my senior colleagues wanted an audience with me. And why she wanted that audience was that she claimed to have a lot of experience in policy development. I thought, fantastic, because this, remember my story, this is what I wanted to do. And so she arrives, sits down, and I says, tell me what all the policy development. And she said, well, with the Australian Health Promotion Foundation, I have written the inclusion policy. You have written the what? What? Show me how. Well, this is the document. I've written the policy. This is generally how most people in the Anglo-Saxon world see policy. You know, a document. That's the policy. Politics is everything that comes before, around, and after it. Contention, conflict, discourse, to resolve what would be required to actually do the policy. It is helpful to distinguish when you talk about policy analysis, for instance. I don't know whether you do that in your course, between an analysis of what works and an analysis how it works. Because once you start to look at how it works, you get much better information to avoid mistakes the next time around. And most policy analysis is just saying, did it work? Yes. Okay, good. Or it worked only so much, but that's it. The success parameter for my own teaching, I don't know whether you've done that, Patrick, but in courses that I teach, at the beginning, I ask students, would you want to become a politician? Because in the survey that I do, they generally say, well, policy, it's important, but it's like a boring trade. You have to write stuff, and you have to set priorities, and they have a very technocratic almost view of that process. So my question is, do you want to be a politician? And most of them say, no, it's a dirty game. It is terrible. I'm not cut out for it. I'm not ready to be hurt. By the end of every course that I've taught in 4 different universities, there's at least 60% more of those students that say, yes, I want to be a politician, because then I can make sure that I have the tricks and talents to beat the bastards. Because that is what matters in politics, that you know what's going on and how to get to be right, not just be right in evidence, but convince them that what you want is a better outcome than anything else. And every time that makes me proud, that all of a sudden 60% more of the student population wants to get into that dirty game. Yes, I've won.
No, thank you so much for a very inspiring afternoon, and I love the kind of connection you have between the two. That's just great. I'm just in. Oh, so my name is Anne Lisa. I'm a professor here in community health and epidemiology. I'm just intrigued by the role of social media, artificial intelligence, that is, that has started to play a big role between health policy and politics, and also misinformation and the kind of things. So what is your take on those, these kind of phenomena, social phenomena that exist, that are going to maybe trump what we kind of knew about politics and of course, healthy policies and so on?
In the summer of 2019, Health Canada surveyed all the scientists who work for Health Canada and the Public Health Agency of Canada. And the survey included a question, what are the 3 biggest challenges that you think are facing the doing of science by Health Canada and the agency? And misinformation was number 3, and this is before the pandemic. All which to say, it has been growing over a long period of time, number one. Number two, I teach MPH students. So at the beginning of the term, I asked them, I'm going to use the word news. What does the concept of news mean to you? And then I then asked them, okay, let's all just be honest. Let's be blunt with one another. Where do you get your news? And I don't know how I said it. The phases of the moon aligned, and they were brutally honest. Oh, I get it on my TikTok feed, or I get it through Instagram. My parents, it's Facebook, but that's like what old people do, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And a couple of students said, well, you know, I get the CBC News summary sent to my phone. So at best, they were getting headlines from a reputable journalistic source. And at worst, it was getting whatever the algorithm was feeding them. This is really important because when I teach political science, I'm having to adjust to the fact that there may not be a shared language, right? Our politics for much of the 20th century was built on the assumption that we were all watching the same news sources and we had a shared definition of the world. We don't. 3, so where do these algorithms come from? Well, as recently as 3 years ago, we might have been naive, but this guy named Elon Musk bought Twitter, and we can, now it is plain as plain can be, that these algorithms are incredibly manipulable and manipulated. But boy, it's hard because you try and curate your feed and you think, you know, there's a limit. So it is a huge problem. Having said that, in political science and in the political class, talk about the concept of the newspaper of record. So in Canada, in French, it's La Presse. In English, it's the Globe and Mail. To which the immediate response sometimes is, well, the Globe and Mail is a very conservative newspaper. Oh, that's terrible. Well, they might be, but they take their role as the newspaper of record seriously. They try and give you a reasonably comprehensive statement of what's going on in national politics. You may not like sometimes the spin, but they take seriously their goal of an informed public. They still exist. The fact that my students don't read the Globe and Mail is interesting and important, but at least it means that there are a group of people who have a shared language. We watch CBC, we read the newspapers, we read La Presse. Some of us spend much time on it takes me an hour in the morning to get through my media, right? And why is this important? Because it's that shared language that allows us to push back against the craziness coming through social media feeds and misinformation. The final thing I'd say is we're getting better at it. You can study misinformation and disinformation in a systematic way. We know way more than we did 5 years ago. There are labs at U of T, there's one in Montreal somewhere. Professor of law at the University of Alberta single-handedly is doing this. The Royal Society has written a report. Like, we now know way more about sources of misinformation, and we are also doing natural experiments in real time. How do we combat it? How do we counter it? It's hard. It's going to be super hard, but we're not helpless or we have agency. Our governments and as we as individuals have agency. But for those of you who have to deal with undergraduate students, and I always forget this, we cannot assume when they walk into the classroom that when we use what we think are everyday words, that they know what those words mean. And you can't go back to grade school with it, but you have to test out the extent to which people actually have a shared language. And it's not hard. Heck, if I can teach MPH students federalism in 2 lectures and a bunch of readings, it can be done. But we should not assume we have a shared language. And again, it's not impossible, it's just we have to be very mindful of it. Universities are not very good at this, so we're gonna have to get better. But we're learning a ton, and it's now, but so you mentioned AI. I don't know about the University of Saskatchewan, but my university and my program, we are in crisis. We're having to reinvent our pedagogy to take into account artificial intelligence. And frankly, I don't know what it's like in medicine and public health. In social science, we're lazy. We teach the way we were taught. We write assignments, and we can't do that anymore. We have to take this and start all over again. It's gonna be a lot of work. It can be done. The good news is artificial intelligence is so cool. Like, it saves enormous amounts of time. So I'll leave you with this anecdote. I had my students do some work, and I asked them to read the Public Health Act and 80 pages. And then I said, write me a statement at the end of your essay where you told me how you used AI. So a student writes, well, I asked ChatGPT to give me a summary of all of the things. So I talked about the assignment on Tuesday night, and I said, okay, let me explain to you why ChatGPT cannot write a summary of a statute, of a law. It never occurred to them that it was a kind of writing that was not summarizable, at least not by ChatGPT. Oh, yeah. But the students understand the limits and the risks and their lack of literacy. It's up to us to tool up and have a conversation. And 20 years ago, I used to say, when your computer doesn't work, find a 14-year-old kid and I'll explain it to you. My students, in some cases, are ahead of me, and some cases are behind. So we're all learning this together. But it's early days. But let's not be naive. I mean, we're being manipulated in real time. So we just have to fight back.
So for me, the big problem with social media is that they're not really social media in the way that we understand the social world. Because in the past, when I would walk out of this building and in the street would start shouting that a crazy man runs the United States of America, someone would come up to me and say, you can't say that. Now, I can say that right now, and it would be considered a mild observation. So the world has changed, and we still don't properly cope with this. For me, the whole concept of influencers, people who are peddling something or idea or that then are followed by 1 million people who are interested in how you boil an egg or apply mascara. That is unimaginable. So I'm still an old media person, and I appreciate new media, and I think that's what we should call it, and not social media or whatever. AI for me, is a tool. And it's a very haphazard tool. Often it makes mistakes, and when you point that out to the AI, because it doesn't have any emotion, it says, yeah, that's right, was a mistake, bye. But so that's what you should always ask.
You can only know that what you get back from the large language model is an error if you have context. So our job is to equip our students to have just enough context and or the critical thinking skills. So you were giving the example, some countries like Finland are way better at teaching critical thinking than we are in North America. But the good news is it can be done. But it's now more important than ever because we have to be critical. It never occurred to anybody when I'm sitting there watching my father reading the Edmonton Journal that we had to adopt a critical lens. I mean, we should have, we didn't, but they weren't that out of line. We now live in a world in which most of the media consumed requires the critical lens. And for public health students in particular, it's tough because, of course, if you don't know what you don't know, then, right? But here's the good news. Public health attracts the best and the brightest. My public health students are an amazing cohort of people because these programs are hard to get into. And so what I've discovered is that they're like sponges, right? And they're way better than the median of my policy students. So the good news is we attract really bright people. We have tools to equip them, and they'll run with it. But it's going to be bumpy. It will continue to be bumpy because we're all learning in real time. We're building the plane while it's flying.
So thank you. And I know there's probably a lot of questions and so on, but we have taken probably half an hour or more than we had originally planned. And so this has been really wonderful and very rich. Obviously, what you've shared with us today has resonated deeply with people. And I think we'll be thinking about this and probably coming with questions. And I want to say, if this is the discount page, if you want a hard copy of the book, I'm the same as you. I like paper. There's a discount code on this. Those of you online could email me if you want the discount code and I can send it to you. Sylvia.abney@usask.ca for those of you who don't know. Dr. Neudorf is going to come up and just wrap us up and tie this to the work that the signature area is going to be doing at USask related to this.
Yeah, and I just want to thank everyone for coming. I think this has been a very rich conversation. So I want to give you a preview of how we can continue this conversation. One of the things we're doing on campus here with our health and wellness signature area is trying to create some venues for that interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary research to flourish on campus in these types of topic areas. So we're coming up with a few scenarios or topics where there's interest in pursuing that and trying to create a venue for taking the next step. So we've heard a challenge from our speakers today about how we could be doing that kind of better research, better teaching, better practice in this integration space of public policy, public and population health, and politics. We have some examples of projects around campus that have been doing that or considering doing that. And we're going to be naming a date sometime in the next 5 or 6 weeks. So look for early to mid-May to bring researchers together who are interested in this topic. If this has sparked an idea, or if you've already got something you're doing that you think is linked, let me know. I'll make sure that you're on the list. We'll be publicizing it as well publicly. We'll be getting a space on campus here, spending, depending on how many people seem to be wanting to come, somewhere between half a day or a full day in a facilitated session for people to pitch their idea with the group and then break into small groups to talk about how would we pursue it. That might be a research idea that you want to write a grant on, or something you're already doing but you want to add collaborators to that research. It might be an idea for a new way of teaching collaboratively between different programs. We heard an example here of how to perhaps change the way we teach public policy. And so let's pursue that a bit more. How would it look on campus? Who would we get involved? How would we further that idea? So we're hopeful that it would spawn some new grant applications, perhaps some new working of curriculum and examples of collaboration across campus in this space. So you can watch for that in the next week or so. We'll be finalizing a date and a place. In the meantime, if you want to make sure that you're on that list, I encourage you to email me and I'll make sure you hear about it as well. Okay, I think Sylvia, do we still have time for relocating up to CH&E, or are we at the end of that now? Okay, so our speakers will probably only be here for a few more minutes. If there are some burning questions you want to come up and introduce yourself, do that. But in the meantime, can you join me in giving them a round of applause?